Father in heaven, we just thank you for this time you're giving us to come and worship you, pray to you, and to learn from your word. We pray our minds and hearts be open to understand what's coming from Exodus chapter 21, and be with Lauren as he brings us the word, his guiding direction. In Jesus' name, amen.
So we'll be in Exodus chapter 21, starting at verse 12, work through the first part of the chapter, verses 1 through 11, laws on servants or slaves, as really probably would be a better term considered slaves. So we saw that the system of slavery, we're going to see that going forward with the rest of chapter 21 and into chapter 22. It's very different than what we think of as far as the Western slave trade. The slavery here was part of the criminal and also civil judicial system as opposed to be a workforce based on oppression and racism. And so there were limitations put on it. It was a very different system. And we're going to see that emphasized here through the continuation of these laws in chapter 21 as we move into verse 12. So let's start with Exodus 21, verse 12 through 14. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. So we see here that murder under the Mosaic law is a capital offense. Verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. There's a limitation put on it based on intent. There's a differentiation between murder and accidental killing here. That if the individual did not do this on purpose and it was accidental, he'd be allowed to flee to a city of refuge that would be later established. In verse 13 it's mentioned, and I will appoint for you. These haven't been established yet because they're still in the wilderness, but these would be established in a place that they could run to. And it would serve two purposes. One, so that individual who had not committed murder, but had accidentally, in a work accident or something like that, killed a neighbor, would not immediately be put to death wrongfully. So it's for the protection of that individual. But it is also for protection of the victim and justice, in that if that individual fled there and was found that he had acted with premeditation, as it says in verse 14, even if that individual in the city of refuge, even if he's taken a hold of God's altar and asked for refuge, that individual will not find refuge because that individual is guilty of murder, and it would be a capital crime. So it says here that even if you shall take him from my altar that he may die. That an individual who flees to that city wrongfully after the judges determine the individual's guilt or innocence, the individual would either be cleared of that charge or would not be cleared of that charge. So there's a couple things here that we see in this Mosaic law is there's a differentiation between murder and accidental killing. And then secondly, there is some sort of judicial system. Judges are going to judge, because it says 14, but if a man acts with premeditation against a neighbor, there needs to be some sort of judging that's implied in that verse, that it's not just a vengeance killing, but rather there's a system to decide guilt or innocence before God. And this is very much a contrast to ancient Near East law at that time. Around the other countries, whether it would have been Egypt or would have been the Canaanite tribes that we would be headed towards, ancient Near East law at that time viewed killing a little bit differently. Often, there was a mandatory vengeance killing regardless of intent. So if an individual killed somebody, it was expected that the family of that individual he had killed would send somebody out to kill the individual, regardless of intent. It didn't matter whether it was an accidental or whether it was premeditated murder. That it was expected that there would be a vengeance killing regardless of intent. So here this Mosaic law would have stood in contrast to that, revealing both to the Israelites and to the other countries around it something about their true king and their true God, Jehovah. Because part of the purpose of this covenant, part of the purpose of Israel at that time, was that others would see and wonder, what is it about them that's different? And one of the things that's different here is their capital punishment, which wouldn't have been unusual for countries to have capital punishment at that time. But what would have been unusual is their capital punishment was built more on justice as opposed to vengeance. Additionally, in many of the cultures around at that time, the death penalty would have only been for a killing of equal class, not for a killing of lower class. And so, if an individual of an upper class were to kill a slave, that wouldn't necessarily be a capital offense, because that slave in the other cultures was seen as somebody who was purely property, who did not have any rights as a human being. Where under the Mosaic law, we're going to see it didn't matter class. If somebody murdered, it didn't matter whether they murdered somebody of a higher class, the same class, or a lower class, it was still a capital punishment. This is partially why within Egyptian culture, we've talked about how that the pharaoh or somebody in Pharaoh's household could basically kill with impunity. The reason is they would have been considered the highest class. They would have been considered as almost deity in the Egyptian culture. So for them to kill somebody, well, of course they had to be lower class, because that's all that existed in their eyes. And so because of that, this would have stood in very contrast from those cultures that only saw, okay, if you kill somebody of equal class, then vengeance is needed. Lower class, it does not. See?
So remember last week we were talking about the indentured servants?
Yep.
Would that be considered, because you just said slave, would that be considered a lower class?
Yes. So whether it's indentured servant, whether it's debt slave, whether it's slavery, keep in mind what we've been talking about with this, the Hebrew word that sometimes in some English translations translated as servant. The Hebrew word can be translated slave, it can be translated servant, it can be translated even employee or hired worker. So often in context, you kind of have to figure out which it is. In this case, servant, slave, we should pretty much consider interchangeably, even though in our culture we think of them differently.
So if two people were of the same class, and this guy falls on hard times and decides he's going to basically sell himself into indentured servant to this person, he now becomes lower class.
Essentially, yeah, from what I understand, yeah. But keep in mind, within the Mosaic law, other than that individual now having to work for the household they're working for, they didn't lose the rights like they would have in another culture. Because even though it's common in ancient Near East law for murder to be acceptable if it's a lower class, we're going to see that's not true in the Mosaic law. And that individual, even though now they are being a servant to either work off a criminal debt or a civil debt, they didn't lose their rights as a human being. They were still prioritized as being more valuable than possessions were. Because we're going to see under God's Mosaic law here, there's kind of a hierarchy. The law started with human rights, so to speak. And the first ones in chapter 21 were of servant slaves. That sets a tone and a standard for this law that would be very different from other ancient Near East laws. Because basically it's saying the first priority right at the beginning is human rights, and human rights of the individuals who are typically treated the worst. and humans who are most likely to be either abused or taken advantage of. It lays out those individuals are just as important in God's eyes. So we have here setting down capital punishment as far as one who commits murder, but there's a difference between murder and accidental killing. And additionally, this is a contrast to what would have been kind of standard law at that time. And then it expands on that in verse 15. And he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. This is an extension of the Ten Commandments as far as honor the father and mother. Because clearly striking a parent, physically attacking a parent, is not honoring that individual at all. Now, likely this he who strikes here is a little bit stronger connotation in Hebrew than what we think of as just like slapping somebody or something like that. This is attacking somebody and leaving them on the ground, injured, or possibly thinking you're walking away from them dead. So this strike here is a vicious attack. Now, this vicious attack does not have to end in death here to be capital punishment. The standard here is, you kill your neighbor, that's murder, that's a capital offense. You attack your parents, that physically injuring them, that is also a capital offense under the Mosaic Law. Because it took very much the importance of the individual honoring the authority that they were under. If an individual within their household did not honor their parents, would they honor anyone else's authority? And the answer is probably not. And so this individual was seen as an individual who was a danger to society at large, basically. That if this individual was going to do this to their parents, what would they do to somebody who is a stranger or somebody they met on the road or a future spouse or something like that? And so because of that, they take this very seriously. It's a little bit more, though, than just, slapping a parent or something like that. It is the Hebrew here very much a vicious attack and leaving the person on the ground and walking away from them heartlessly. The other thing that's also in here that's a little more subtle, but would have stood out a little bit more in ancient Near East law in comparison, would have been he who strikes his father or his mother. Here that's showing that the mother and father were given the same status of honor. In the Ten Commandments, it's not honor the father, honor the mother. It's honor father and mother. And here that emphasizes it, that in God's eyes in the family, father and mother have an equal value. And it's not a one is lesser than the other in terms of value. Now certainly, we see throughout God's Word that fathers and mothers play different roles in that. Something that I didn't think to comment on last time, but kind of jumping back a little bit, we were talking about, let's see, verses 4 to 6, in chapter 21. If the master has given him a wife and she has borne sons or daughters, his wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And we talked about why that might be as far as both the groom and the wife in that scenario have been servants. Both were serving a contractual term of potentially 6 years. And the master of the household brings the two of them together. And first, the servant, the man, doesn't have to pay the bride price, gets married. Now, when he's served out his 6 years, he can go free. But if the wife has not finished her 6 years of service, she can't go free yet from her obligation of servanthood. And here it almost reads like the wife and her children shall be her masters, as if the children are born into slavery. But keep in mind the age of those children. If this happened during that kind of 6-year window, those kids at most are 6 years old. So if you're having the husband going out to work somewhere else, returning to his household, or possibly even selling himself to another household, the custodial parent in that culture would have to be the mother, especially if the child was still nursing age. Because the father wouldn't have a source of running to Walgreens and getting formula or something like that. So the children had to stay with the mother for protection of the children and their growth. So part of this here is, and it's not, we talked about this more in detail last time, it's not that those two are then divorced. The husband would have had potentially 3 choices. One would have been, as we see in verse 5, if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, he can choose for he to remain a servant in that household permanently. Or he could wait until his wife's 6 years are up, and then she no longer owes service and are reunited. Or if he's able to earn enough money fast enough, he could redeem her and purchase her with basically a bride price that would have been owed to the master at that point. So here, I don't think that, going back to that it was that the wife and the children were seen as lower class. The man can go free and the wife and the kids can't. It's that in that scenario, the wife still owes an obligation of service for the money that was paid out and needs to fulfill that. And the children need at that age absolutely to be with their mother because of the role that she would play in their nurturing development. And so they would not have been separated. So we see this emphasis here on the value of parents and the value of family reinforced in verse 15. Verse 16 we've already covered, but he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. This is a really important verse to understand the servanthood or slavery that's being discussed here. Because that slavery cannot be based on the slaves being kidnapped or in any way forced into slavery. So it's a very different model than what we think of what happened in the Western slave trade, where individuals were kidnapped, oppressed, and forced to be sold into slavery because they were seen as being inferior because of their ethnicity or their skin color. That's not what the basis here. In fact, it's not only saying here that slavery based on kidnapping force is not just wrong, it's a capital offense. It's not just saying that this is something wrong, you get fined for doing it, you get a slap on the wrist. This is, if you are trying to steal somebody's life wrongfully, and monetarily gain from that by selling them, that is a capital offense. Additionally, it also indicates it's not just the individual who kidnaps. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. Anybody involved as a slave trader would be considered under this as far as the death penalty. So it's, the individual can't say, these kidnapped slaves who are in my possessions here, I didn't kidnap them. I bought them for this individual. It wasn't me and not blood on my hands. I didn't kidnap them. I just bought them fairly. I paid money for them. No. It's saying here, if he is found in his hand, if that individual is in possession of humans who have been kidnapped and sold, that individual is considered just as culpable and has capital punishment. So this completely outlaws slave trade based on oppression,
We still have laws like that, so if you're in possession of stolen property, you can't keep that. You
Yes.
can't steal it.
Yep. And to kind of moderate the justice with that, if an individual can show that they didn't know that was stolen property, and I suspect in this case, if they could show that they didn't realize, I don't know how they would have realized, but they didn't realize this, that there would be, in this case, since the stolen property could speak, it would be much more difficult for the individual to not realize what is going on. Especially since, we talked about last time, the one doing the selling would have typically been the one who owed the debt, the individual himself, or their close family. So, like I said, 16 is a really important verse for understanding the slavery that's referred to here. The slave trading, being the middleman is wrong, kidnapping is being wrong, and we talked about how the Near Eastern law is a little bit different than Western law. Western law, everything's spelled out specifically, exactly, point by point. Near Eastern law, principles are set down, case law is given as examples of that, and then the judge judges and extrapolates based on that. So here, somebody could say, well, I didn't kidnap them, I just forced them to gun them. Well, no. The extrapolation of this is forcing them somehow with a weapon is also kidnapping. Blackmailing them into that by, well, I'm going to do harm to your family if you don't sell yourself into slavery. Well, that's by force. And a judge at that time would interpret that and say, no, that's still forcing you, who just blackmailed this individual into slavery, is in fact guilty of a capital offense. It's a little bit different as far as how law is viewed in the Near East, especially ancient Near East. 17 reinforces verse 15. He who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Now here again, we have to recognize that the curse here isn't just an individually verbal offhand comment to their parents that they regret type of thing. Oh, that's a capital offense. They took honoring father and mother to be very serious, but not quite to that extent. Here, cursing should be seen first off as the opposite to honor. It's an antonym to honor. Next, this is a very strong curse where that individual goes out publicly and swears an oath against their parent or to harm their parent in some way, or wishing harm upon their parents. Going out and publicly proclaiming that, wishing that the gods would rain fire down on their parents or something like that. So this would be a very serious curse that would be taken very seriously as far as the individual wishing that on their parents is enough to bring the death penalty. So having no respect for parental authority, again, seeing that as a marker for somebody who would have no respect for any authority at all. But you see also why in, not just the Near East, the Eastern culture in general, even today, the respect that is paid to elders and parents is often different than in Western culture, where we very much value individualism. It's my way or the highway type of attitude. Whereas you see that in Eastern culture more strongly as far as very much respecting and honoring elders. Now sometimes there's problems with that as far as that would go too far in venerating and respecting elders to the point where turning them into deity or gods that are worshipped them. So there needs to be a balance with that as far as honoring father and mother, but not elevating father and mother above Jehovah God.
Yes?
Verse 15 and 17 seem so similar. I wonder why they're separated.
Eastern literature was often structured. Especially in the Old Testament, that you'll see that very much it's often structured with a parallel structure, where you have these layers of parallel structure, something will be stated and then it will be restated. And then in between, there'll be something that's related that is potentially a core important concept. Simple parallelism is used all throughout poetry, as far as you'll always see in Hebrew poetry, where something's stated and then it's restated. It's not built in rhyme or rhythm, it's based on parallelism. And same thing as far as for narrative, and same thing here in the law, we see some parallelism. And so these laws are kind of layered, like an peeling onion skin type of thing. And you work your way into a core principle, and then you work your way back out the same way you came in. And so it'd be the type of thing that it shows up more so in the Hebrew than it would in English, because some of the markers of parallelism, some of the wordplay that's used, is kind of lost in translation. But I suspect it's very much an intentional parallelism here that is setting up, first, the importance of that honoring parents and clarifying that. And then secondly, we see in between that, anybody who is using force to kidnap is not worthy of honor and is worthy of the death penalty. And I suspect there's also more parallelism in this. I really didn't have time to go through the full structure of this, but I know there are spots in here to emphasize certain things related on parallelism. The other reason for using parallelism is because, unlike us, paper and written documents were really very expensive. So very limited in how many there were. And so because of that, very often a group of people might listen to something being read, and that parallel structure helps with memory. That wordplay in Hebrew helps with memory. There is, let's see, let's skip ahead. Where is it here? It's later in this chapter that I thought I could find. It's in chapter 22. Yeah, in chapter 22, verses 5 and 6 are an example of that parallelism. In chapter 22, verse 5, if a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed, and less looses animal, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain, standing grain of the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. So both of these are about fields that get damaged, and restitution is at work. So they're in parallel. But not only that, in Hebrew it's more obvious. In Hebrew, the same word for grazed is the same word for consumed. So in verse 5, if a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed, basically that word consumed, the animals consuming the field, is the same Hebrew word that's used in verse 6 for fire breaks out and consumes the field. So it'd make it easier for an individual to remember that with this word play, that field gets consumed by animals, the owner of the animal owns retribution. Field gets consumed by fire, the same consumed word there. Retribution is forgiven. So throughout this, there is, yes, a lot of that type of parallel structure that's used.
You're pointing out the importance of parents and also the importance of land.
Yeah. Also the importance of justice in terms honor is owed to the parents, and individuals whose possessions that their livelihood is based on, food, is also important for life. Both of these come back to really the importance of life. That child would not have life if it wasn't for the mother and father. That farmer and his family would not have life if it wasn't for the crops. And so if those crops are damaged, justice is due. If the mother and father are damaged and are not honored, justice is due. So there's a consistency there in terms of an importance in a hierarchy in life, basically. And I don't mean a hierarchy in life that one life is more important than the other, but that life is more important than physical possessions. We'll see that comes into play even with some of the laws on theft in chapter 22. But continue onward here. Let's see, verse 18. So now we've moved from kind of capital offenses to physical offenses that may or may not result in death. So if men contend with each other, and this is verse 18, if men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. He shall only pay for the losses of his time, and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. Now first here, from our perspective, as far as in verse 19, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, we might get the image of, well, if he could drag himself out of bed and move around with crutches, it's okay. It's okay, he didn't die. That's not it. A staff was the shepherd's working tool. An individual wasn't able to carry and wield the staff unless he was in fit health. So here the image is, he's getting up, he's completely back to normal, back to work with his staff, and there's been no permanent injury to this individual. And in that case, the individual who beat him up is acquitted of any sort of criminal charges. However, the individual who beat him up does have to provide, as it says in verse 19, loss of his time has to be, so however many days he was in bed, and his medical care. So instead of having insurance, the individual who beat him up had to provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So good medical care, not just some water or whatever. It's thoroughly healed here. And so here they have, as far as physical injury, is not going to be a capital offense. And this is in line with the eye for an eye principle. The eye for an eye principle is often saw from Western culture as being this vicious way of everybody ending up without an eye. It was really the law of retribution in that the punishment should fit the crime. A thief who steals a loaf of bread and then her hand is cut off, that violates the eye for an eye principle because a person's hand has way more value than a loaf of bread. Which is why we're going to see in the Mosaic Law, that type of thing did not exist because it would have violated that principle of retribution. So here, it's not that when the individual does well, he gets to equally beat the other individual and put them into bed. It's that he gets the money for his lost time and the medical care. Now, what if the person who beats him up is so poor they can't afford that? That person is so poor can get money by selling themselves into slavery. Back to the why somebody might be sold. So instead of that individual being incarcerated for beating them up, instead of that individual going scot-free, or instead of that individual being killed or maimed in some way physically, that individual owes the equivalent financial, and if they can't afford it, they then sell themselves into slavery where now they're in a work situation where they're earning skills that maybe they don't need to continue a life of crime after they finish off their payment. That's the other thing that's built into this, is the individual, instead of being incarcerated, the individual is reconciled.
I mean, they really didn't incarcerate people then, right? They had no way of holding them and guarding them and feeding them.
When you have basically a nomadic people who are living in tents, you pick up the tents and move around and stuff, it's very difficult to have a prison. And so because of that, violent crimes were a capital offense. You execute them. You don't imprison them for life, because how do you do that? And it's a danger to be trying to incarcerate people for life in a tent. And there's just too high of an escape risk there. But non-capital crimes would have meant some sort of fine that might have to be paid by service as selling yourself as a slave. And in that individual, their food and clothing was provided by their employer, because they couldn't afford them. So instead of paying taxes to support the prison system, they're doing it within their household. And that individual has to work long enough to cover their room and board, plus cover whatever they owed, plus work long enough that when they're sent out with, as we saw last time, from Deuteronomy, you shall not let them go away empty-handed. You shall supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. They're not sent out empty-handedly, because if you're sent out empty-handed, how are you going to survive? You're not. You're going to be right back to committing a crime or being right back in debt. And so the individual had to work long enough that they had not only paid all